an invocation.
You would bow with me in prayer. Dear gracious God, we come to you tonight, Lord, so thankful for this day that you've given us. We thank you for our health, the ability for us to be meeting here tonight. Father, we ask that as we go forward in this meeting, that the discussion be fruitful and beneficial for the city of Mount Pleasant, its residents, and this board. We ask for your protection as we leave this place. Watch over us and our families, and continue to guide and direct our steps. And we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So Frank, can you lead us in prayer?
I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, sir. First order of business is reviewing the minutes from 2 months ago.
The minutes that we'll need approval on is from October 6th, 2020.
Are there any objections or changes or additions we need to make to them?
Motion to approve, says Lindsay.
I have a motion to approve from Lindsay,
Second.
second from, cranberry. I was going to say cranberry because of the season. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passed. Sorry, Jackie. I was going cranberry. We don't have any old business to talk about, do we?
No, Chairman, we don't.
So we just move on to the new business, the discussion of the design guidelines.
Okay. Also, number 5, we don't have any hearings tonight with any persons. So, yeah, we can move on to new business. That's what the Chairman says to do.
That'll work.
All right. Well, thank everybody for joining. Glad to see everybody can make it on Zoom. So, the new business tonight is old business, is discussion of the design guidelines. Can everybody hear us okay?
Yes.
Mr. Dawson?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, in our last meeting, we were discussing the design guidelines, and we had done reviews based off of the previous meeting, and we had a little bit of discussion at the last meeting. And I thought Corey, our attorney, Ms. Jones, would be better to speak to the legality of our design guidelines and our zoning ordinance and how they should complement each other. And unless the board has any further discussion or has any questions from me, I think I'll just ask Ms. Jones if she'll speak to us in regards to that.
All right. Hey, everybody.
Hey.
So, Robert asked me before y'all's last meeting about the historic zoning guidelines and basically what to do if they are in conflict with your regular zoning ordinance. And so I know that you're going through the process of finalizing your design review guidelines, and so I think we need to talk about how these things work together, like Robert said. So you already have a zoning ordinance in Mount Pleasant, and that applies to, you know, every property within Mount Pleasant, and it separates them out into the properties out into different zones, like commercial downtown, residential, high density, what have you. The historic zoning guidelines are going to work as a supplement to the regular zoning ordinance. So what you're going to do is you're going to establish a zone, as you know, that has that's for the historic zone. You may have more than one as time goes on, but I think you're starting out with one. And then this historic zoning guidelines will be the rules that will go on top of those properties. So basically, the guidelines are a supplement to the regular zoning ordinance. So all that to say, they need to work together. They don't need to be in conflict. They can be in conflict as in the guidelines can be more restrictive, but they shouldn't be just totally different. So I know you've looked at some, like signage or setbacks or things like that. Anything that you put into the new historic zoning guidelines needs to be rules, restrictions, regulations that are consistent with the historic zoning look that you're going for. So these are things that would specifically apply to these properties because they are in the historic zone. So it is a supplement to the other zoning. So when somebody comes before the Historic Zoning Commission wanting a building permit to do some new, or a certificate of, I forget what it's called, certificate of appropriateness, they're going to have to be in compliance with the zoning ordinance, all the parts of the zoning ordinance, and they're also going to have to be in compliance with the historic zoning guidelines. So they need to be able to be in compliance with both of those documents so that y'all can issue this certificate of appropriateness, and then they can build or make the changes to their structure that would be compatible with your historic zone. So really they're complementary. So it's a lot of words to say they need to work together and that this is a supplement. The historic zoning guidelines would be more restrictive than your zoning ordinance. It works the same way as a historic zoning overlay, or any of the other overlays that are in the historic zoning, or, sorry, any of the other overlays that are in the zoning ordinance. But this is just a separate procedure that was established by the legislature for historic zoning. But it will be binding and it will be a supplement to what's already there. So they need to be compatible.
Corey, I have a question.
Yes.
What we were discussing was the signs regulations, like a corner building, and we had a meeting with, you know, Tom Moriarty, correct?
Yes.
Okay. We had a meeting with Tom, and one of our, and I had sent him our design guidelines for this, and one of his questions was, why did we not allow a business that's on a corner to have more than one sign, to have a sign on one, like, just take Smelter, for instance. Not that they want one, but if they should be able to have a sign on Bluegrass and a sign on Main Street both. But according to the city sign ordinance, they cannot do that. So is that, as the historic overlay, overlay in our design guidelines, could we allow something like that, is my question.
Is that something that would be more typical of a building or commercial building in the historic time that you're going for? Is there any historic reason that is important? Like, as far as I know the point of the guidelines is to make these buildings look more like they would during this, or preserve them so that they will remain looking historic. Is that something that preserves them or looks more historic, or is that just a difference that these businesses would prefer?
No, I mean, we haven't talked to any businesses or anything. This was just something that he made a note of.
Yeah.
And what Robert said was that our sign ordinances in the historic district had to be the same as the city.
They don't have to be the same, but they need, anything that you're adding or making different needs to be because is more compatible with a historic zone.
Okay.
Not just because you like it, or, you know, if we wanted to change that altogether, we could do that through the zoning process with the city, and make them both compatible with this way. But I don't think that's, and I don't know anything about historic architecture or anything like that, but, it doesn't sound to me like that's something specific to a historic time period.
So, if we came up upon something that, it wasn't the same as the city ordinances, but it was historically significant, then we don't have to be exactly like the city
Correct.
ordinance for the rest of the city. Okay,
You can make it more restrictive so that it preserves the historic look.
okay. Thank you.
And a lot of cities, I think Savannah, the one that we looked at a long time ago, they did a historic zoning overlay, which was throwing me for a loop because that's the procedure that I'm more familiar with as far as like, you know, going before the planning commission and changing the zoning and then having 2 readings with the city commission. That's the typical way of changing the zoning. But then with this, the historic zoning commission creates a new process for that. So we are still creating essentially zoning regulations. We're just doing it a different way because the legislature created this new path.
Okay. Thank you.
Robert, I'm not sure if I answered any questions at all for the commission. Do y'all have any other questions?
I think we just want to be sure that the guidelines we put in place aren't too conflicting with the zoning ordinance like you were talking about. But, you know, for example, it says only one sign is allowed, where you might just want to have something that constricts the signage square footage totally versus one sign, for example, like Donna was saying, if it was on the corner. We just don't want to be too conflicting, but still be able to place these rules around the historic area.
Yeah, I think I was reading some of these differences that were pointed out, and some of it might just be wording. They may be saying essentially the same thing, they're just not worded the same, so you have to go through this analysis of, is this more restrictive or what have you, but you can definitely add more restrictive regulations for the historic zone. It just needs to still be compatible. So I think you are going to have to go through and make sure that, or somebody, maybe it's me or Robert, go through and make sure that each new regulation or restriction is supplemental and not conflicting with what's already in place. So that's going to be a little tedious, but you can definitely add more restrictive regulations to the historic zone.
And I don't think we want that we're looking to get more, to be really restrictive. I mean, I think that we just want these guidelines to, if someone buys a building down here, for them to be able to stay within the guidelines, to help them get to where we want them to be. Does that make sense?
And I'm not saying restrictive is in a bad way. I mean, the whole purpose of this is to make sure that the district remains looking historical and it preserves it for future generations. So I just don't want anything I say to make y'all think you can't add more restrictions to it. Or, you know, the entire purpose is to make sure the building looks like it would have in this more historical time period.
Okay.
Thank you, Corey, for, I guess, kind of discussing that in length with the board here. I'm in agreement. I think we just need to make sure that they don't need to conflict with each other. And like you said, be complementary to what's already in place. I was thinking about this while you were talking, you know, we've got more than just the historic overlay. We have an airport overlay, you know, I mean, there's other overlays, and we work closely with the airport to try to get as, you know, close as possible to what the zoning requirements were, versus being, number one, it's too confusing for anybody to really operate out of, and then, you know, number two, that they complement each other in the whole aspect of what we're trying to accomplish. It's not, so I guess the best thing for us to do is really dig down into the guidelines that we've got, and the specific portions that affect the zoning ordinance, so they don't, you know, conflict with each other in a bad way, unless the historic guideline requirements are more restrictive, which would be allowed by law. But I don't 10-foot high, you know, just for example, to me, if I was coming in here and gonna, you know, want to put a sign on a building, or you know, somebody's coming there to talk to me, and we had these passed right now. So the certificate of appropriateness would be brought to the board under the guidelines that we've got right now. There's one section in there talking about signs and locations, where projecting signs for commercial buildings shall be at least 10 feet above a sidewalk. And our zoning ordinance is 8 feet. So I don't know how somebody could navigate that. I don't know how this board can navigate that. I don't know how I could navigate that when it comes to getting the paperwork on my desk.
Is there any historical significance to 10 feet versus 8 feet?
I think those are the kind of things that we're going to have to work out before you grant these guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said earlier, Corey, we don't want anything conflicting. We don't need to confuse the general populace any more than they already are. So I think we're going to have to spend some time, probably with Robert, going through these and making sure that we don't have anything that conflicts. I guess Robert's probably in the best position to do that, since he's very familiar with the guidelines that he has to follow on a daily basis. And this could be something we could discuss at a future meeting and work through with Robert.
I agree.
Yeah. Corey, actually, these guidelines came from Collierville,
Okay.
and I put them together. So this is a draft, is all that it was ever meant to be. So what I think we need to do, since we aren't familiar with our Mount Pleasant zoning ordinance, that either you or Robert need to go through these and highlight for us the areas where they do conflict, and then we can look at those and see if they have historical significance, and if we want to keep those the way we are, the way they are in here, or if, we just change it, just like the sign. I don't care whether a sign's 10 foot above or 8 foot above, as long as people can get under it. So to me, that has no historical significance. It's just what theirs was in Collierville. So if we can go through those and match those and see where they differ with what Mount Pleasant has, then this committee can decide on what we want to do with the downtown one. If we want to be more restrictive or just go with...
Got it. To ask a question about Collierville, do you know if they did a historic zoning overlay or if they did guidelines?
They have, the overlay is the area, correct? Is the zoning area, because that's what we're doing, is an overlay.
So,
That's what we're working on.
You're-
And we passed our overlay.
you passed the zones, right? That's what we're calling the overlay?
Yeah, we mapped out the area for the historic zone, yeah.
Okay. So, the other overlays that Robert was talking about, like the airport and, forget what the other one is, but they actually have rules just like the zoning ordinance does. So they establish zones, they have a map, but they also have they have the rules, which we are now calling the guidelines. So it's two separate processes, and for me it's been complicated because I'm using the wrong words, but I think what we are doing is we're establishing historic zones, and then we're establishing historic zoning guidelines that match those zones.
Yes.
Where we're more used to a historic overlay, which is actually it becomes part of the zoning. So the historic zoning guidelines will not become part of the zoning ordinance, which means they won't have to be changed the same way that that the zoning ordinance is changed. But, I talked to Jane Catone,
Yeah, I know.
a couple weeks ago, and we went over this for like 30 minutes, and I think we finally just determined that we're using different words. Like in regular zoning, it's the overlay, and you have to pass things through a specific statutory process. This is a different statutory process, and so the guidelines are the equivalent of an overlay, but they are different.
Okay.
The same thing is a different process. That's the simple version of what I'm trying to say. But I agree. I think that we can go through, I think Robert's already gone through this a little bit and pointed out some items that are conflicting with the current zoning. So there may be some things y'all can go ahead and talk about, but I do think they need to match to some extent. But that's a good process, I agree.
Okay.
And, I mean, I'll be glad to, review the guidelines more in depth. I ask that y'all would do the same. I know you're not that familiar with the zoning ordinance, but you can be real familiar with the design guidelines, I guess. So I can review both of those documents and indicate in the design guidelines where it might seem conflicting, in my opinion, because I'm handling it from, the paperwork's going to come to my office first, so y'all got to keep in mind that I'm not trying to be hard-nosed about anything. I'm just trying to line it up to where I can actually operate and do the right thing and get it to the board. And when it comes to the board, then we don't have to be discussing how it conflicts with the zoning ordinance. We can just discuss what's on the table in front of us. And because when it comes to my office, I'm looking at it through the lens of the zoning ordinance and the historic guidelines when we do get them finalized. I just want to have something to present to this board that clearly is in line with regulatory zoning ordinance and statutory guidelines that's in place and set forth by this board. So that way, it don't waste a bunch of unnecessary time for either you nor the applicants. But, everybody can kind of be on the same page. So I'll be glad to go back through and review the entirety of the guidelines, Donna, and the rest of the board, along with the zoning ordinance. And then I'll send that back up to each individual with my findings on both sides. And I'll even include the zoning text in which it may conflict with, or, counteracts with, I guess. And then that way y'all have all that documentation in hand, and everybody can give it a just review, you know, before we meet again, if that sounds good to the board. That's just a suggestion from my part. I can't say that I would get it done before January, but I can promise you I'll put due diligence and get both those documents taken care of. But our bylaws say that we need to meet every month, certain day, certain time. So I guess tonight, my hopes is that the board would give me just a little more time than just a month to come back. And maybe, you know, maybe it's February before we come back, instead of January or even possibly March. I want to put good effort into reviewing both documents for the board.
Well, I think Robert, I think that's reasonable. I think it's important that we get it right. I think that's more important than how fast we get it done. And the kind of things that you can point out are, you know, where we've got a 2-foot difference in the height of the sign. Those are the kind of things we need to eliminate. And so whatever time, if the rest of the board agrees, take whatever time that you need to do this so that we get it right to begin with.
And Robert, we know that this is more work for you, and I really appreciate it. But you are the only one here that would know that the city says 8 foot and this says 10 foot. We
Yes.
have no way of knowing that, you know, without going through every one of the city zoning things. So, I mean, I really appreciate you doing that and taking the time to do it, and know that, you know, that it is. So I agree. I don't see where we're not going to put you on a schedule to do it. We just need to have a heads up, and I think all of us can read through all of this, make notes if you have any questions on it, and maybe that's what we do at the next meeting. At our January meeting is make notes on what we have questions about that we've seen, and then whenever you get that done, we can go back through and be ready to go ahead and make changes and then vote on it.
Well, I appreciate it. I thank y'all for giving me, you know, just the availability of time to go through the document. Because, like I said, I want to make sure that I'm bringing everything to the board. That way y'all can make the decision, make the necessary changes that we need to make prior to this going into effect for everybody. So, I don't know that we necessarily need a vote or anything as far as the time limits go, but we could meet back in January, and like Donna suggested, maybe just y'all go through the guidelines themselves and
We can go through the guidelines themselves, and then we can get an update on where you are. And if you can bring in, like, examples of what you have found,
yeah,
so we can just,
yeah.
they help, you know, guide us with our reviews too.
Okay. I'll be glad to.
And that, I mean, yeah, because I agree with Don. I'd rather have it right than try to defend something that's wrong or not complete. It's what it feels like, not wrong, but incomplete.
Okay. Good deal. Does anybody else have any questions, or Lindsay?
Nope, I'm good. You know, don't forget, we will be applying for the grant to have somebody come in and help us with the guidelines as well. So that's, you know, we'll have that going forward too, once we get there.
Have the zones been established by ordinance yet?
I'm sorry?
Have the zones been established by, or the historic zone, has it been established by ordinance yet? No?
No, it has not. Okay, so Corey, I've got a quick question for you, in relation to I don't know if you got this piece of paper with you or not, but basically it's the creating a historic district, the steps, okay.
I think we're on number 6.
That's what I was gonna ask you. I believe we're on number 6, which is propose a local historic zoning district and create the accompanying design and guidelines. Now, my question, I guess, is, since this board has voted and approved the zone, before we go to the city commission, for an ordinance for that particular zone, does the guidelines need to be associated with it in the same ordinance? Because on number 8, it really says nothing about it.
Well, I think we have to have the public hearing for the design guidelines before we actually establish the zone.
Okay.
Let me look back there. I can send it, I'll look at that and send you an email of exactly where this process is. When I was looking through my records, I found a draft of the ordinance, but couldn't tell if it had been passed yet. So the answer is no, we do not have zones created.
That's correct.
Okay.
We just have the ordinance that was passed, I think, speaks specifically to the creation of the board.
Yes, yes.
That's the only ordinance that we've passed.
There's another one already drafted, for the creation of the zone, of the historic zone.
Okay.
We did vote, this committee did vote on the, area for the historic zone.
That's correct.
The HCC did.
Yes, but it hasn't gone to the commission.
And I guess my question to you is, should the design guidelines and the district go together to the city commission? Or...
My tentative answer is yes,
Okay.
that they go together.
Okay.
I'll check into that and get back with you with a better
Okay.
answer.
That's fine. Does anybody else have any questions for Corey?
Nope, thank you.
Thanks, Corey.
Corey, thank you.
No problem. All right, Robert, I will get off here. Just let me know if you need anything else, okay?
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Does anybody else have any discussion or questions or anything?
No.
Nope.
Nope.
So if there are no other questions, I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
We have a motion.
President, I might as well.
Who seconded that?
You said who?
I second.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Bye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Thank
Meeting
you, everybody,
adjourned.
stay safe.
Thank y'all, y'all have a good evening.
Yeah. Stay safe and test negative.
Yes,
Right.
yes. Y'all take care.
Bye.
Aye.